Hi, this is John at the Flight Academy. I am putting this video together as a result of a feedback I got from a speech I gave at CX in 2024 in Knoxville. Gave this speech to a room full of instructors, a few hundred people there, and I had a lot of feedback saying, I wish I'd known some of these things or been given some of this advice when I was a newer instructor. And so here we are. I'm going to record it and put it online. If you're a flight instructor, especially within the last few years, you've just started teaching, this might be good advice for you, especially if you're still learning to become a flight instructor. Hopefully this is pretty good for you too. But even if you're not a CFI, if you're working on private or instrument or even a commercial, this could be useful information because it tells you a little bit about what CFIs are doing, what we're looking for, what we're thinking about as we are watching you do your training and specifically in this case about flying in a traffic pattern. I think it is useful to know what the CFI's thought process is as we're teaching these things because it's not a secret. None of this stuff is supposed to be unknown by you if you're a student pilot or other than a flight instructor. So stay tuned if that's you. This speech in particular comes on the heels of some data about landing accidents that we've seen in the Cirrus world specifically, but this is not unique to Cirrus at all. This is all general aviation flight training. So we're not unique in any of this stuff. So I will be referencing Cirrus topics, but some of them. But generally, most of this information is going to be useful for any CFI. So stay tuned if that's you for another aircraft type. The problems that we've seen is that there have been a number of occasions where we've had accidents in the traffic pattern, some of them unfortunately resulting in the loss of lives. Lessons learned from these kinds of things, and then stuff as a CFI who's been teaching a long time, like me. I've been a full-time flight instructor for 24 years, and things that I could say about that. Observations I've made training new flight instructors with the Flight Academy that are experienced, 500 plus dual given, which is not nothing, but still some information that I've seen even doing interviews with people who hope to become flight instructors at the Flight Academy, things that were maybe missed and why. So I want to dispel a few myths. So that's the topic for today. Pattern best practices and how to be a good flight instructor in the pattern and or how to be a good student there. Our big challenge is the time that we have available to react when you're in a pattern situation. When you're up high and say downwind at about 1,000 feet or so, there's some time. We're not far away from the ground, but we're not terribly close to it either. And what we want to look at is that altitude is time. That's an old saying, and I also want to include energy equals time. Energy can be in the form of airspeed or a power plant, even potentially on an airplane. Energy gives you a little bit of time too, so we need to be thinking about both, and you're going to hear me talk about that as I go through here. We're going to have a look at the ready position, at least in a Cirrus airplane, for a CFI to be sitting at and why that's important, and some things that you don't want to do when you're sitting there at the ready. Talking a little bit about how far to let it go. This is one of the main reasons I wanted to talk about this. One of my big pet peeves in aviation is the advice that we give to people, CFIs, when they're new or student pilots learning to land. We use soft language or fuzzy language. You'll get a feel for it, or if you feel fast or high or low or slow or something like this in the pattern. I don't like those kinds of vague terms because that's very subjective to the person who's learning it. Different people might feel just fine when they see 4 white pappies. Other people might feel just fine when they see 4 red ones, and not necessarily know why. So I want to talk about more quantitative statements to get to a qualitative one, if that makes sense. I'm going to talk about some tips and ways that we can intervene, when we should intervene, verbally or physically as flight instructors. and then talking about what we've seen now. We're on the ground again, we've flown, and talk about some tools that I like to use, at least currently as I sit here in April of 2024, tools that I have available to me, and that's an ever-evolving world, as you all know. Context is important for what we're talking about here. In this scenario, the flight instructor is attempting to allow errors. The student pilot, the person who's practicing their pattern work here, has done enough of them that they know the standards. They know what is correct, and they are practicing it. So this could be definitely a pre-solo person. We're getting close to solo. They know IFOM is a Cirrus document for Flight Operations Manual. It's awesome. If you're a Cirrus pilot and you don't have that, get it. It's absolutely the best $50 you'll spend. And then ACS, of course, that's standard for all of us. The certification standards, I think any student pilot who's about to solo should know what the FAA considers certification standards, because these are effectively minimum safe standards that the FAA is communicating to us as to, if you can fly an airplane within these parameters, you are safe, baseline safe if you're within these parameters. And if you're outside of those parameters, you're not. So I like a student to know what those things are. So in my scenario here, we've taught them these things already. They know what those correct practices are, they know what the standards are, and now they're working on it. So you as a CFI are shifting from a teacher and a coach to more of an evaluator at this point. CFI wears kind of three hats. First we're a teacher, then we're a coach, and then we're an evaluator through a natural progression of training. And so we're now putting our evaluator hats on. We're going to try to be quiet, which is very hard for us to do. And these are useful even when you're not trying to be quiet, but it is very important to get a really authentic look and a really authentic evaluation. You have to be quiet. You have to let the mistakes happen. But that's the challenge, because how far do I let these mistakes go? So before I get too much into that, let's talk about the guard position. Now this is a Cirrus guard position that we're going to look at. It's going to be a little different from different aircraft with different control configurations. Here's how we sit. Right arm on the armrest just after the stick, and left arm, your left elbow kind of back with your hand down low as depicted here. We've got the right hand fairly close to the controls, but not hovering so as to make a student nervous. The left hand in a position where we could get to the throttle, but again, not hovering so as to be distracting to our customer. If you are going to take over the throttle in this kind of situation, come from under their hand so you can catch mixture and throttle and push them both forward without a worry about your hand kind of skipping off of their hand, and thus you don't get the power that you wanted. As you can see here a little bit closer up. Right hand resting but ready and ready to go. Left hand there sitting back, ready to come from underneath the students and bring the power forward if we need that. I think it is important, at least it was for me, I'll speak for myself when I was learning to fly. If my CFI was hovering really close to the controls and I could see their hands an inch from the controls ready to snatch it away, that made me nervous, because that told me implicitly we are in grave danger, and this person is so concerned about letting me have these controls that if I sneeze, we could be dead. So they are so close and ready to protect us both from these things. And that was super distracting. I didn't do the best landings I could have done because some of my gray matter was going to what the person in the right seat was doing. We can be armed and ready to intervene in a very, very fast reaction time without being, for lack of a better term, super obvious about it. So when we talk about the time that it's going to take to react, which is kind of the point there with the guard position, the time and therefore your tolerance to errors is going to decrease with altitude and energy. As we get lower and slower, we don't have as much time to react. So low altitude, low energy equals the lowest tolerances. And we'll see more what I mean by that specifically with some hard numbers coming up in a couple of slides. The concern here, of course, if you're low altitude and low energy, one rapid maneuver or one rapid control input from your customer is going to put you in a dangerous place. So these are the high-level concepts that we're working on, right? I haven't used specific numbers yet; those are coming, but This is the basic concept: low energy, low altitude, low tolerances. Airplanes that are as controllable as a Cirrus, anybody that's flown one knows these things are very controllable. But the downside, the other edge to that double-edged sword, is that the customer could over-control the airplane and put us in a bad place quickly. And that's why we are having this low tolerance to low energy, low altitude. Accidents that we've seen, as I was talking about earlier, show how important this is. If we don't have hard lines, we could get ourselves into trouble and let it go just a bit too far in the pursuit of learning. So speaking of, we have these kind of conflicting goals. We want to let this naturally progress, this landing exercise, and let our students progress towards the ground, maybe making a few errors and us not correcting them, but we can't let it go even 1 second too late. And that's the real challenge. The CFI is thinking, I want to let this go, I want to let problems occur and then my customer address them, and that's awesome. But I can't let it go too long. And a lot of us err on the safe side, and sometimes too far on the safe side, in my opinion. Now, new CFIs, don't worry about too far, right? If you don't feel good, get out of there. Listen to your gut. You've heard that before. You're hearing it again. It is absolutely paramount that you don't let the pursuit of constructive mistakes put you in a bad place, right? So don't let it even go 1 second too late. But I want to put some parameters around how long I let them go, and that there's two ways that as a CFI I can respond. First, verbal, and second, a physical correction. And then here in a few more after that, once we get these established, I'm going to talk about what we need to be focusing on to keep the airplane flying. Shouldn't be too groundbreaking, but it's a good thing to come back to those basics. So we're going to step through a traffic pattern and look at the decreasing tolerances. So now here's the hard numbers that I was talking about. We're going to go into the pattern and slightly below base, below final, or below 500 feet on final, and then finally the round out and the flare. I kind of break this up into these 4 sections so where my tolerances are going to change and get tighter and tighter and tighter. And this is something that a lot of people are naturally doing, but again, I like to put specifics to it. So to begin, we're in the pattern down to about 800 or so AGL, which is roughly where you would be going from downwind to base. If you're, the way your SOP works, it does it for us in the Cirrus. We are actually descending a little bit on downwind before we turn base. So TPA down to around 800 feet or so. Again, ACS and IFOM are the expectation. The student knows the expectation in these scenarios. The CFI is evaluating and attempting to allow mistakes. So again, just to be very clear, that's what the scenario is. We're still fairly high comparatively, and we have a fair amount of energy. So we're at a fairly fast speed relative to stall speed, that is. We're well above stall, and we're still pretty high, or at least 1 or 2 mistakes high, as some have said. So you've got some time. So I, therefore, will allow up to 200% deviation from ACS before I'll say anything. If we're flying along in the pattern and our target pattern altitude's 1,000, which it is in the Cirrus, and my customer is sitting at 850, am I happy? No. But I'm an evaluator right now, and I'm not going to say anything. And this is valuable. I am going to take a note. This is acceptable in skill building. I'm going to start taking notes. I'm going to look at the timer and see what time it was when I noticed this problem. And then I'm going to see how long it takes for my customer to notice the problem. This is very useful in the post-briefing. And it tells you one of 2 things via the conversation that's going to happen in post, where you can say, when did they notice the problem and how long did it take them to correct? Or did they not recognize that this was a problem, being 150 feet low in my hypothetical? Now, I still haven't said anything. We're 150 feet low, tolerance plus or minus 100. So my ACS expansion is 200 before I'm going to get involved verbally. And I'm letting the student tell me as the educator what I need to know. Are they not noticing it? It took them 30 seconds and then they popped up to altitude. Great, now I have data. What that tells me is their workload is very high, and perhaps they are a bit distracted by staring at the runway the whole time as they're going on the downwind and not coming inside to just verify some of the essentials. Their workload's too high. We need to figure out how to decrease that workload. This is great for future training. They've now taught me, as their teacher, some of the stuff that I need to know. So very acceptable in skill building. Is this acceptable from a check ride standard? No. But I want to allow this, and it's safe to do so. Very hard for CFIs to shut up, but you got to do it, okay? So that's 200 feet, 20 knots fast or 10 slow from the reference that we use for our SOP. And I'm looking for a bank angle not to exceed 35 degrees. Again, what's the normal? It's 30. We don't like to see go beyond 30. But again, I want to allow a mistake to happen. So if they get to 35, I'm still not going to say anything. I'm going to note that and go, hey, we got a little steep a couple of times there. At least for this particular airplane, that's steeper than we ought to be. But I'm going to allow the mistake to happen so I can have an authentic evaluation of what they're doing. Coordination is important. Coordination is one of those things that can sneak up on you very quickly and can be very difficult to recover from. Part of that is because it's happening from the customer's feet. You can't see them. You have to feel it, and it's a really good idea to hover over those pedals, but you don't want to be on the pedals, otherwise you're influencing what they do. So I have a fairly low tolerance about incorrect coordination inputs, incorrect rudder inputs when I'm in the pattern. If I see a customer push with any amount of force in the wrong direction and go, whoops, I meant to do it the other way, we need to get out of here. We're not ready to be at 500 feet or in a flare, because they have no time to react, or you don't have any as a CFI. We need to go out, we need to practice rudders and play around with that a little bit more and build some more of the basic understanding in the customer's mind about how their feet should be interacting and what it's going to do. That's okay, that happens sometimes. But it tells us, again, as instructors, what we need to know, and it also shows the customer it's very important to not progress if you're having troubles with this. We should not be down doing flares and roundouts 100% solo just yet. So continuing, I'm now on the base leg, around 800 to 500, we're descending. At this point, I've tightened the tolerances a bit to the ACS standard. If we exceed ACS standard for more than a couple of seconds, 1 or 2 seconds, but we are stable, or if we get a rapid trend, a very aggressive move out of the customer, or very rapid airspeed or altitude change, I'm going to start getting involved. Otherwise, I'm going to be quiet. But I am going to allow up to ACS. Now I'm not at my 200% anymore. Now I'm at ACS, plus or minus 100 feet while we're descending. Hard to do there. Plus 10 minus 5 knots on the airspeed. Now that's getting pretty important because we're beginning to slow down. We're applying flaps ostensibly, certainly are in a Cirrus, and slowing the airplane down closer to the stall speed. You still have a reasonable amount of altitude, but I put the asterisk on there because I know it's less than it used to be, right? And it's getting less all the time as this progresses. Hence our tolerance is getting tighter. The trends are very important. Is the airspeed or the pitch changing rapidly? Is my customer being aggressive with the controls? How many of you look at your students, look at their faces, at their heads when they're in the pattern? Many CFIs love to look where the student's looking out at the runway. Look at your customer. Is their head staring at the runway the whole time on base and they're not really scanning the altitude, airspeed, or power setting? That tells you something. That's a problem, by the way. We should be coming inside and giving a glance to our energy status as the pilot in command. And if they're staring at the runway the whole time, and it's understandable, right? They don't want to overshoot. They've undershoot or overshot enough times that they want to stare at that runway so as to start the turn at the perfect time. But unfortunately, they're going to omit, in this scenario, airspeed, and it could get away from them. They may not even know that they were pitching up, because as you turn your body, your shoulders shift, your arm shifts, and your hand on the controls are going to shift. A very slight pressure may be applied, and they begin to change the pitch attitude of the airplane and not even know about it. Again, useful information for the evaluator, which is you, the CFI at this point, to see that they are unaware of that. Time to go talk about that on the ground. And then, of course, the coordination issues are still in play. That's true for the whole thing. If I see any of those things get outside of ACS for, again, more than a couple of seconds, or I see any rapid trends, or I see a lack of attention, there's an omission, we need to get out of here. We're just going to abort early. You're also teaching your students that it's okay to abort early, because it is. Below 500 feet, now we're on final. Now it's definitely getting interesting. You are at a very low altitude, relatively speaking. You're at a relatively low energy state, and your tolerances are very tight at this point. 100% ACS at this point. If we go 5 under, 10 over, granted ACS does talk about turbulence, and you should too. ACS makes some allowances for that if you're getting a little bit gusty and the airspeed knocks up to 11 knots over for just a split second, then it comes back. It's not what I'm talking about, but definitely on the slow slide, it's something you're going to want to pay attention to, particularly in turbulent air. If we get outside of the tolerances, go around. Yes, we're at 300 feet, and you're at minus 8 knots, let's say. I don't like it, and we're going to get out of here. We're going to inform and teach our students that a good landing comes from a good setup. And a bad setup is likely going to give you a bad landing, or at least a heck of a lot of work. And you don't need to do that to yourself, so we're going to get out of there. If you need more than about a 10-degree bank angle to adjust an overshoot or an undershoot, then you've overshot or undershot too much, and you should get out. Don't try to fix it. Get out of there. Break off from the approach earlier rather than late. If we see aggressive control inputs at this point, then that means the customer is probably pretty stressed at this point, and we should get out of there. If they're stressed out, they are over controlling, they're going to be aggressive. This is not likely to get better the closer you get to the runway, where the stakes are higher and higher the closer you get to the ground. So if I see aggressive over controlling, we're out of there. We need to nip that quickly, especially in a cirrus that's pretty controllable. If the airplane's not configured, that's an easy one. We forgot to put the flaps down. Now here we are at 400 feet. IFOM says nothing below 5. You're not configured, time to get out of there. Just get out. And again, we're teaching our students, we only accept a good setup. Not perfect, but a good setup. And if those things aren't working, get out of there. Do not show your students how to salvage a landing. I can't tell you how many NTSB reports and even how many people I know of with a bent prop or something like that. Nobody got hurt, but the airplane did. And oftentimes, very, very often, the vast majority of them, it was a salvage attempt on a bad setup. All right, now we're rounding out in the flare. We're at the minimal energy, minimal altitude, so minimal time. Any over-controlling and pumping, control pumping, that's a habit that comes from other aircraft. I know some less controllable airplanes require a bit of larger movements because big movement and small change in those airplanes. Well, not so in a cirrus. You're going to find the airplane moves the nose up and down, up and down, up and down as fast as they can move the controls. If they're doing that, we should get out of there. In the cirrus, if you can't see the end of the runway over the nose, this is an important one to teach your students, you're going to hit the tail. Or at least you probably will. You're maybe 1 or 2 degrees pitch attitude-wise from touching the tail on the ground. If you can't see the end of the runway, you're going to hit the tail in a cirrus. And so if you see that, get out of there. We've pitched up too much. Now we're in salvage territory. We don't want to be there. If the round out is pretty high, they arrest the sink rate to 0, a good 20 feet or so up above the ground, we're going to have a bad time, right? You're either having to figure out how to get fancy with the power or let the airplane come down, or at the most likely you're going to have a thunk of a landing and it's going to be pretty firm. All of these are things that people try to fix. Don't try to fix it. Get out of there. This is not fix-it territory. And certainly if you bounce, one bounce, go around. Do not attempt to salvage a bounce. You will have a bad time. This is how prop strikes happen in cirruses. Some people can get away with 2 bounces and not hit their prop. As far as I'm aware, nobody gets away with 3. The 3rd bounce, the prop touches. That's it. Again, that's a cirrus thing. Your mileage may vary in other aircraft types. And again, I'm back to one incorrect control input. It's rare, it's very rare, I would say, but I have had customers do that, and it's not their fault per se. They're in way over their heads, right, stress-wise, and that's how humans do when we get stressed out. Sometimes weird things happen, and if I get an incorrect control input, we're going to jump in and take over, and this is a good time for the CFI, if I have any of these things, to physically intervene themselves. I'm not going to verbal at this point. I'm just taking over, and that's what I advocate if you see any of these things happen. And one last time, to really put the stress and emphasis on it, do not salvage landings. We don't want to save a landing. That's not how this works, right? We're learning to fly, we're learning to land. And if you attempt to try to salvage, you're asking somebody to do exactly the right things, exactly the right amount, exactly the right time, no more, no less. That's a pretty tall order, and I mean, I've got a few hours, and I still, you know, I've done it myself, right? I've tried to salvage a landing. They're never pretty. Just get out of there. Just go around, and again, show your customers that this is absolutely fine. A go around is actually a really good thing. And for me personally, a student pilot who's about to solo cannot go solo under my watch unless they show me the good judgment and a go around. If they execute a go around on their own because of these things that I've just gone through, I'm ready to sign that person off because they have the most important skill that they need, which is good judgment. If I'm calling go arounds, they are not ready to solo. So use that. All right, now we're going to go around. So you're the CFI sitting next to them. You've decided to intervene. You're going to take the controls and go around. This seems pretty basic, right? But I've definitely run across this with experienced, you know, several hundred hours dual given CFIs where some of this stuff didn't come as natural. Maybe it wasn't understood as well. And that's okay. It's not your fault if you're one of those people. We don't do the best job in the aviation world of training brand new CFIs with 327 hours or whatever, and they just got done. We cover the basics, but we don't really get into the nuance. So let's dive just a smidge into the nuance. The most important things at the beginning is we need energy. We need power, smoothly increase it to maximum, especially if you're in a turbocharged airplane. It could be a little bit of lag. You don't want to compressor stall the engine, bring the power up 1, 2, full, and you're there, right? So get energy into the system at this point with power. Keep it coordinated. You'd think it's enough to say that, but this is a surprise to very few of you, but I mean, speculate for yourself right now. In the landing accidents that we've seen over the decades that we've been doing this aviation thing, guess where the wreckage ends up in a landing accident where a go-around was initiated? It's on the left-hand side of the runway. Why? There's why. It wasn't coordinated. It is not necessarily intuitive when the power comes in and the nose begins to come up for a person to push their right foot down. We're trying to make it intuitive in flight training because it needs to be. But in all these accidents, when we find the wreckage on the left-hand side of the runway, it's a pretty clear indicator what didn't happen. And I'm occasionally bummed out when I talk to CFIs and I say, you know, tell me about a go-around, and the answer does not include a rudder. And that's a bummer because that's a really big deal, that rudder. Pitch is important too, of course. Smoothly pitching to level and then slowly, continuously up to about 7 degrees for us in a cirrus, for my cirrus drivers, about 7 up. But level it first. The wheels may touch the ground in this scenario, all 3 of them at once in a level pitch attitude. That's okay. Let the airplane continue. Don't try to change your mind, right? You're aborting, keep aborting, going around, even if the wheels touch. Continue, but slowly pitching up. What am I managing here? Of course, it's my AOA. We need to make sure that we don't stall the airplane. but we don't need to yank the nose up. Power and coordinated and a level flight gets us energy, and then slowly pitching up to 7. And by slowly, I'm saying a couple of seconds, 2 or 3 seconds. 1, 2, we're at about 7 or something like that. But sudden aggressive movements, certainly not going to do it. But know that once you've got power in and you're coordinated, you're going to stay over the pavement, you're going to build energy into the system. Heck, you may even be in ground effect, and that's helping you. But we are going to climb away. AOA, coordinated, get the energy in. We are going to get to flaps. Some of you have been thinking about that, but we're not in a hurry in our Cirruses, even in our SR20s, which some of us who are spoiled think that 215 horsepower is on the low end. Sorry, Cessna pilots, but the flaps, we're going to get to it. But important things are to get to the energy first. Now, some airplanes, especially 162s, 152s, I know if the flaps are all the way down, you may not be able to climb out, and you've got to get to those things more promptly. Okay, get to it now, though. After you've established those key things, power in, coordinated, and at least to level flight and a slow, steady pitch up. For Cirrus pilots, the airplane's going to climb. The SR-20, the 22, the 22T. The airplane's going to climb with the flaps all the way down the end. Don't get too in a hurry. I don't want to leave them there forever, but give it a couple seconds. Stable, then begin to clean up. You've got some drag hanging out there. You do want to get rid of it, but it's not as urgent as the other things. Get that airplane stable and in an energy building condition, and then start retracting flaps. So that's some basics on there. So now CFI tips, these are more generalized. Bug the traffic pattern altitude and use the audibles. What I mean by that is, and this is good for any G1000 pilot that has verbals from your system. If you bug the pattern altitude, when you're turning from, that should say downwind to base, but you get the point, you should hear altitude enunciated. You've descended about 200 feet below the bugged altitude, and that usually happens about the time you're turning base. Okay, so as you turn base, you should hear altitude, and if you don't, then that tells you something as a CFI, without even looking at the altimeter. We haven't descended enough, or if you hear it early, we've gone a little fast. So you've got some data there. Another one, we have a verbal at 500 feet. The system in the G5 and G6 and in most G1000 equipped airplanes will enunciate 500. It'll just use its words, right? That should happen in the base to final turn or established on final. If you hear it early, or if you don't hear it at all and you're well established on to final, that tells you something without even having to look at the altimeter. Not that I'm advocating you don't, but you can use these triggers, these cues, to build in some good situational awareness as a CFI. When you hear that 500, I personally tie it to a trigger. I look at that lower quadrant. Where's my mixture? Where's my flaps? That's it. And nothing critical, right? We're going to be ostensibly on the ground or going around in the next couple of seconds. I don't want to switch tanks or do anything like that. Just where's the mixture? Where's the flaps? Make sure you're aware of it. It's easy as a CFI. We're trying to pay attention to a lot of stuff to miss a customer failing to configure the airplane. So we're still at flaps 50, let's say, or something like that. I notice it now at 500 feet. Now I have a decision to make. It's a tough one as a CFI. Do I shut up and let it keep going and see how this one plays out? Definitely CFIs with experience can try that. Or do I want to mention it now and say, we're below 500, go around. See what happens. We're below 500, which is the minimum altitude for config changes. So there's a thought. Some things not to do. Definitely with a Cirrus, this is for my Cirrus pilots, shorter than a 3,000 foot long runway is worthy of caution. I'm not saying a Cirrus can't go into these places, but if you're not a pilot that flies into them regularly, then your short field landing skills may be a little rusty, and it could get you into trouble. Just give yourself some extra room. So I'm not saying don't go into 3,000 footers. I'm saying get your antenna up. Make sure that this is a reminder to you as a CFI. to be really paying attention to what your students are going to be doing on short final. A little bit of extra airspeed on a short runway, a configuration mishap or something like that, or power mismanagement could make that 3,000 foot runway, which is, again, plenty, could make it real short real fast, get you into trouble. Density altitude, that has definitely caught a few of our friends in the aviation world, especially in the cirrus world, attempting to do a go-around or even just an initial climb out with a high density altitude. My personal rule is if I can't do 500 feet per minute right after takeoff and climbing up en route, at least above TPA, pattern altitude, don't do it. Cooler air, better winds, anything like that. But if you can't do 500 feet a minute, you've put yourself in a very, very tight box where a little bit too much pitch up and you're losing energy, not enough pitch up, and you're not going to be getting the altitude. So you're in a pretty tightly margined space there. I find that around 5,000 feet density altitude for an SR-20 is roughly where I'm encountering these limitations. Certainly weight and other stuff can play into this, but be mindful just as a general rule of thumb, hey, density altitude over about 5,000 at the airport, we could have some trouble. We really need to get very specific about the terrain and optional plans, and maybe think about altering our plans. Keep in mind that what the book tells you is not necessarily what you're going to get out of the airplane, because if you're up high, you're probably in mountainous terrain, and any mountain pilot that's ever encountered a downdraft right after takeoff can tell you how scary that is. And if you haven't, you're probably thinking about how scary that could be right now. All of a sudden, that 500 foot per minute climb that you were going to be able to scrape out of your SR-20 is 200 feet a minute, or maybe less. And a 300 foot per minute downdraft is not uncommon. Like, it's not every day, but you can certainly find those things. And they're invisible, or at least they start out that way. Unfamiliar terrain, speaking of, just be cautious. Spend some time looking at where you could send the airplane. This isn't a mountain flying course, so I'm not going to wax poetic about ways that you could analyze the terrain, where you should go, where you shouldn't go, and that sort of thing. There is a lot of very good value in that, and again, it's outside the scope of this. So do some mountain flying training. Lots of good resources out there for that, but spending some time familiarizing yourself as a CFI with a territory that you're not as familiar with should definitely be a thing you do. Keep in mind that as an instructor, these are the people I'm talking to right now, a client seeing you exercise hard limits on personal minimums is a powerful, powerful lesson. This is a professional. This is somebody who is, by all accounts, and they would acknowledge, better than they are at what they're trying to learn how to do. You are a professional. If you exercise personal limits, the customer will see that and understand that that's behavior that they should emulate, which they should. If you don't exercise personal limits, if you're willing to fudge some of these things, and there's a lot more that we could certainly talk about, if they see you fudging these things, you've now shown them that the limits are more of a guideline than a rule. We don't want that. That's not safe in aviation, and it's not a target for our students. This is why we don't salvage landings. We don't compromise our limitations, our personal limits, or our company SOPs, or even personal SOPs if you've got them. For an over-controlling customer, this is again back to my cirrus instructors, check your client's arm. The arm rest is a really good place for their arm to be sitting, their forearm to be sitting while they are controlling the airplane. If their arm is floating, they're going to have trouble controlling the airplane smoothly. So look for floating arm syndrome is what I've been calling it. Are they trimmed? If they're not trimmed, then they are definitely going to over control. They're also, cirrus pilots, you ever watch your students do this? You see, they're like, oh man, yeah, my wrist is killing me. You've only done 3 landings. Your arm shouldn't hurt like that right now. Why does it hurt like that? Well, you're not trimming the airplane. This is useful. These are tells that your students can give you that they're not trimming. They should be trimmed on downwind, base, and final. They should be altering the trim. Obviously, anytime you move the flaps or you make a significant airspeed change, you're going to have to adjust the trim. Watch for signs that they're not doing that. I'll oftentimes say, hey, can I have control for a second? And I won't touch it. I'll see what happens. If the airplane moves, I now know there's a problem, and that can definitely lead to over-controlling. Go up high if you have a student that's having trouble with this, and make them change the pitch and bank as slow as possible. Enter slow flight, do more of that. Have them do those things and then have them do it slower. Approach a landing stall practice and slow flight, and all of this stuff is very useful for mastering these over control problems. It works wonders. Post brief, just very briefly, pardon the pun, always use the ops manual, IFOM for Cirrus pilots and ACS in the post brief. And avoid soft language. Be professional, absolutely be professional. Our customers we respect, they are our clients. They are doing a laudable thing. They're doing training to try to become a good, safe pilot. And you owe it to them to be polite and professional. You also owe it to them to be very clear and not use soft language, like kinda, maybe a little bit, those sorts of things. Be specific. So here we are. When we were on downwind, I noticed you were 180 feet low, specifically, at 2 points, specifically. I didn't say anything because I wanted to see how long it would take you to notice. And if you try to fix it or if you just accept it. Here's what you did. I saw you, and then, I saw you sit there for 20 seconds, and then you gain the altitude back. Great job, but what that tells me is you're not scanning altitude often enough. So, hey, we need to scan that a little bit more regularly. I also noticed you were looking at the runway a ton. It's okay. Come back inside every now and again. Let's talk about picking a point you could fly towards on the downwind to help your comfort with your ground track being not towards or away from the runway. You can give good feedback based on these things, but I was specific and talked about what I was seeing, and I reiterated, here's why I didn't say anything at the time. And again, if you're an evaluator role, this probably goes without saying, but CFIs, tell your customers when you're taking the coach hat off and putting the evaluator hat on. I will not be helping you unless we approach an unsafe situation. Explicitly tell them that. Because with that knowledge, they now know it's 100% on them. And there's none of that, well, you've always said to pull the power out a beam the numbers before. It's not fair to get mad at me that you just suddenly decided not to talk, and you know what I mean. Here's some more specific language. 180 feet low on the downwind does not pass the minimum the FAA considers safe. So we've got some more work there to do. I'm working with you, and I'm calling out the authority, the reference, the safety, the airman certification standards specifically that we are using to try to decide whether or not this is safe. So it's not just my opinion as a CFI that you were a bit low and I want to see that better. It's very specific. iPads have a really, especially if you're using ForeFlight, which most of us do, really handy tool, the breadcrumbs that it leaves behind if you're doing turns around a point, S-turns over a road, steep spirals, something like that, VFR. I love that. So now we're out of the pattern here, right? So, but it can be useful in the pattern too, because you can see how consistent they were on downwind, how consistent their base and crosswind turns were and stuff like that. Breadcrumbs are really nice for that, so turn that feature on. Pictures with the iPad, so valuable. There's so much information you're trying to capture, and you're being quiet, right? As a CFI, you're trying to not say anything, and you want to capture all this good data. Snap a photo with the iPad. Tell your customers you're going to be doing that for post-brief. Pictures can be taken of excellent things. Look how good your control was. Your speed was spot on. You hit the flaps right at the right spot. Here's a little picture I took of you doing it exactly right. So give yourself a break. Or maybe it wasn't exactly right. GoPro is nice, but I find that depending on the positioning and whether or not you have audio inputs from your headsets, it's It's good because it's as real as it gets, right? You were right there. It's caught everything. But you have to pull it off the SD card. You have to process it a little bit. You got to find the germane time in the videos or video that you took. I like the the GoPro, but it has its limited utility. But I'm not trying to say don't use it. It's good for very specific things, but not necessarily am I filming all flights that I do. There's a new tool out there that I discovered just fairly recently in the last 6 months or so called FlyStow. It's free, so that's kind of nice. It does have some limits as far as its utility VFR, although it's got a fair amount. But it's the most robust thing I've seen, and that includes Cloud Ahoy. I find the utility and the interface is easier, so I've been using it also free, which is big for me. It captures everything digital, and to use this, you're going to need a G1000 type airplane with a SD card in the top slot on the MFD. There's going to be a data log generated, and you can pull that data right off the SD card, throw it into FlyStow, recreate many aspects of the flight pretty quick and easy. It's very fast to upload and easy to navigate. The only problem with it is that there are so many options available that learning this tool is a little bit intimidating because there's a lot of things. But the good news is you don't have to know everything. It's like any Garmin system. If you know 20–30% of it, you can make some good use of this tool, and you'll learn more as you go. A couple of examples. Here's us doing some pattern work. This is a video, so I'm going to animate the video. And I'm dragging my cursor around, and you're watching as we go along. Here we hit flaps 50. You can see it enunciated. And we can see our speeds, our descent rates, and things like that, where we went flaps 100. So really good pattern here. That we flew right on our speeds. Here we're coming on to final, few fluctuations on the airspeed, but nothing crazy. And down we go to our landing. And then even when we did the go, we could see when we raised the flaps and hit our top of climb there. So pretty handy from a post brief. You can see a few other things on here. It's got the crosswinds as captured by the MFD, so your mileage may vary there. I can see some of the speeds at various key points, 115 on the downwind, or maybe a smidge fast there, but dealt with it. And then 120 knots on our climb out on the touch and go, right on the recommended cruise climb airspeed there. So pretty neat there. There's also this. This is that same pattern. Start the show. But we can see a lot of useful things. Upper left, I've got flaps and power settings. You can see we just selected flaps 100. It flashes when they're in transit, speed's changing. Bottom left, I can see the map overlay, got ground speed and true airspeed. Bottom right side, underneath the vertical speed indicators, your AGL altitude, some temperatures and stuff like that. I've even got a Google map overlay, so I can see this little lake that we go for. This is going up into Payne Field for 3-4 left on a left-hand traffic pattern. It's a good spot to turn left base, and we can use that. So handy thing too for my student to see, and I could call that out. Like, oh, here, remember that lake? Because here it is. And oh, look, here's a runway coming up. Now, you may get bored as you're post-briefing. On the bottom left there is a 5-second skip ahead. You're going to see me start doing that here in a second, where we're just going to skip forward in time because it's kind of a boring final. You were on speed, you were on config, you made a few power changes, but I really had nothing to say. Here's us coming into land, and in our flare, and we could see the ground track from the green flight path indicators good, and there's touchdown at about 5 to 6 degrees nose up in about a stall. So how handy was that? So bottom right, even you can see a G meter. It'll judge your landings. That's pretty nifty. Speaking of judging, it will give you a score. You'll notice in this one we've got an approach score of 74%. I can click on that and it can tell me why I didn't get rated as highly as I'd maybe hoped. There were some issues with this one, or at least perceived ones. Here's one of the downsides. This was an intentional zero flap landing. So of course we were fast, which is most of its complaints. We were simulating a zero flap scenario, and so we came in fast. Flysto doesn't necessarily know that that's what we were trying to do. But they're now down at the bottom. You can see crab angle low, impact low, distance from center line low. So the control was very good. Pitch attitude and touchdown was plus 9 degrees there on the bottom left. This was a very textbook zero flap landing for a Cirrus. And so it went well. But does Flysto know that you were doing that? Not necessarily, so it's calling it out as problems. Other tools there for rental fleet managers. This is kind of nice. You can throw all your airplanes in, see where they've been. And on the bottom right there where we've got some limitations, approached and exceeded. Yellow is approached limits, red exceeded the limits. And we can see the number of iterations where we had problems. In yellow cases, we were approaching ACS tolerances. In red, we exceeded them. This looks worse than it is because this is a training fleet, so we're doing commercial licenses, right? We're doing a power off 180 landing, so yeah, it's going to look a little weird sometimes. We're doing intentionally no flap and half flap landing, so yeah, that's going to look a little weird sometimes. We're doing simulated emergencies and all that kind of stuff, so you may on occasion find that there is a little bit of noise in the data, but it can absolutely help you pinpoint times and places where we were operating within or outside of tolerances that we should be. And if you're managing a rental fleet where customers are allowed to take the airplanes out and go on their own, this is pretty handy because you can then find a scenario where maybe somebody did something they shouldn't have. They were a little bit outside SOP. I generally like to presume good intent when I talk to somebody. You weren't doing this maliciously, you just made a mistake, and that's okay. I want to talk about it so that the mistake doesn't continue to happen. As a fleet manager, that's a good way to approach it. I want to have a good relationship with my customers. I do not expect perfection. That's never been the standard. And if we see something that could have potentially led to problems or has, I'm happy to give somebody a little bit of free education on, how to not let that happen again, or who needs to do a little bit of recurrent. So again, to recap here, earlier is better than late to intervene, and our tolerance is going to depend on the options. I drove through that fairly lengthy amounts. Go back and view that if you want a refresher. AOA and energy state is primary, especially if you're going around. Coordination is key. Rudder, 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 rudder. We need to be on the rudder, especially in a go-around type scenario where if you're doing it late, you may have very minimal energy and a thin margin on AOA. ACS and IFOM are our main references pre-flight and post-flight. Students should be very aware of the tolerances for the ACS and the recommended standard procedures in the FOM. And if you don't fly a Cirrus, there should be some standard procedures for every aircraft type out there. But ask an expert in those things to where you might find them, because standardize, 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 standardize. That's how the pros actually look like they are that good. It's just do it the same way every time. There are a lot of nifty tools out there. We looked at Flysto, that's one of them. There are others that I'm unaware of, I'm sure. And again, this is April 2024. If you're watching this in the future, hello from the past, but there may be some pretty cool new things coming. I don't know. It seems to move pretty quickly, and we're all trying to find these things out as you go, so keep looking. Thanks very much for your time and attention. I hope this was useful to you, and have some discussion in the comments below this video. I'll keep an eye on them. I still have a pretty full flight schedule, so no promises about my timing on a response, but certainly feel free to email us at the Flight Academy if you've got specific questions. And I'm John again, so thanks and have a good day. Safe flying.
We are the Cirrus Training Experts.